Pertil wrote a book about C.S. Lewis.
Yes, I read it.
And I thought it was very interesting. Pertil, in the first chapter, asks the question, why was C.S. Lewis so successful? I mean, Lewis's books, The Chronicles of Narnia, according to Wikipedia, have sold over 100 million copies in 41 languages. But why was he so successful? I mean, a lot of the things in Lewis's apologetic are not unique.
Thank you for joining us for Straight Thinking, a podcast from Reasons to Believe. Reasons to Believe, integrating science and faith. And now, here's your host, Joe Aguirre.
Welcome to Straight Thinking with Kenneth Samples, a program that highlights the importance of the life of the Christian mind and seeks to evaluate critical issues in light of the historic Christian worldview. This is Joe Aguirre, along with theologian and philosopher Kenneth Samples, also joined by physicist Dave Rogstad. On today's podcast, we will embark on a series of 4 podcasts on the life and legacy of C.S. Lewis. On this first podcast, Ken, you want to talk about the life and conversion of C.S. Lewis and begin kind of a back-to-school special, if you will. This is the time of year that many students, we hope at least, are back in school.
Yes.
And you want to start, as you have been, with a logic lesson. So go ahead and start with that, and then we'll get into C.S. Lewis.
I seem to recall, at least a number of years ago, in anticipation of going back, especially to college students, they used to have a thing called the College Briefing Conference. Does that ring a bell at all? This was up at, of course, in our local area here. There's the camp up in, oh boy, the name of it has just escaped my mind. But it's a big conference center.
Forest Home?
Forest Home.
Okay.
And they used to have what they call college briefing conferences, and they would invite a lot of, more intellectually inclined Christian speakers and kind of prepare college students for going either for the first time or for later times going back to the college campus and being a witness and being able to stand up in the face of the kinds of arguments and attacks that they would receive. I don't know if they do that anymore.
I like that idea.
But I remember C.S. Lewis, of course, was an important component of that. Some of his thinking, some of the books that were written by him.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, Dave, because Richard Pertil, who is a very distinguished academic philosopher, I've used Pertil's books in a couple of the courses that I've taught in philosophy and ethics. Pertil, I believe, is a Roman Catholic.
Yes.
But Pertil wrote a book about C.S. Lewis.
Yes, I read it.
And I thought it was very interesting in the first chapter of that book, and I'll be recommending some books about the life of Lewis as we go through the series. But Pertil, in the first chapter, asks the question, why was C.S. Lewis so successful? I mean, Lewis's books, The Chronicles of Narnia, according to Wikipedia, have sold over 100 million copies in 41 languages. Why? A lot of the things in Lewis's apologetic are not unique. He is utilizing, and certainly he would say that himself, that he's taking mere Christianity and conveying it to people. But why was he so successful? Well, here is my logic lesson. As a public speaker, I like to talk about what I call the 5 C's of communication. When I give a talk, I will ask myself, is it clear? Is it concise? Is it careful? Is it cogent? And is it compelling? Hugh Ross gave me a really nice compliment not long ago. In his own interesting way, he said, Ken's the only philosopher I know that talks in a way that a normal person can understand him. I thought there's a little philosophical bias there, but it was a compliment, and I'll take it.
Right. Coming from Hugh, that's pretty good. Because he's always made these comments that what good are philosophers?
Well, when I first met Dave, Joe, I don't know if you know this, but the first time I met Dave, he asked me, he goes, oh, Ken, you're new on the staff. staff. I said, yes. He said, well, what's your academic background? I said, philosophy. He goes, philosophy? With disgust. Yeah. So I've had to try to persuade them a little bit to respect philosophy.
I think he's exaggerating.
That's great. What an introduction.
Only for effect there, a little exaggeration for effect. But, the idea of being clear and concise, careful, cogent, and compelling, Richard Pertil says that's the way C.S. Lewis was. And the first Christian book I ever read was Mere Christianity. I had grown up in kind of a nominal Catholic family. I really didn't understand Christianity. I didn't really have a clear understanding of Catholicism. But my sister gave me a copy of Mere Christianity, and I read it. And I remember the first thought as I was reading through the book, I thought, this guy has a way of making Christianity seem so intelligent, so clear and careful. He's very careful about his word choices. Now, you might look at this 5 C's, clear, concise, careful, cogent, and compelling. Why the word careful when you have cogent? Cogent, of course, is a word utilized for being rational and logical. But I throw the word careful in there really to emphasize the idea that we need to be aware of other people's arguments. We need to be aware of criticism. I don't want to misrepresent other people's beliefs. I don't want people to misrepresent my beliefs. And so I want to take seriously what other people say. And I think that we're going to see this as we talk about C.S. Lewis. I think the reason why his books sell more than any other, and why in 2000, Christianity Today said Lewis's book Mere Christianity was the most important book of the 20th century. That's
pretty amazing.
That's not a bad award to have there.
Too bad he wasn't around to appreciate it.
He'd long gone by then, died in 1963. But I think that the reason Lewis is the most important apologist of the 20th century is because of this kind of clarity, this carefulness, and because he had such an imaginative mind. Joe, as an editor, as a writer yourself, you appreciate being able to draw people in. I think Lewis had that ability. He could speak in a scholarly, intellectual environment, but he could turn around and write children's novels that just really captured people's attention.
I think that's as I have reflect over my having read Lewis over the years, that's the one sort of thing that stands out, is the clarity with which he can communicate some of these ideas in Christianity, and he doesn't overstate himself. He readily acknowledges that there are times when this is only his idea or his opinion, that he's not a trained theologian, so he may say things that aren't accepted by others, and that's fine. But it you just love to read him. You just you kind of mull over the phrases that he uses, and
he's a wordsmith.
A wordsmith, and that's really something coming out of me, because I'm not that way at all. I don't have the ability. I'm not a writer. It's a real strain for me to be able to write something.
Me too.
That is clear and concise and follows these 5 C's that you're talking about here. And yet it kind of flowed out of him. And I often thought that maybe it came from the fact that he, in an earlier part of his life, wanted to be a poet. And a poet has to spend a lot of time wordsmithing, really being very careful of the choice of words and the choice of allusion and so on. And perhaps his ability as just a prose writer was helped or developed more fully because of this experience he had as a failed poet.
Well, when you think about C.S. Lewis, and in the series we'll talk a little bit more about him as a writer, but I relate very much to what you say, and part of Lewis's appeal is his very careful selection. I remember I wrote an article for Joe years ago, and Joe and I were talking about it. He says, Ken, you repeat words too much. Try another word there. And I thought, oh, okay. I hadn't thought about it. But,
right.
Here's someone like Lewis. You can tell that he had given a lot of thought to the word selection. And so he was a novelist. He was an academic. He was a scholar of medieval literature, medieval and ancient Renaissance literature.
Yeah.
He's a literary critic, an essayist, a lay theologian, and the most important Christian apologist of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
So he was an engaging individual. I thought maybe we could talk a little bit in this program about Lewis's life. I think there are a lot of things about his life that maybe the average person, even a person interested in Christian apologetics, may not realize. For example, he was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He was not born in England. In fact, I read a little bit in Surprised by Joy. He said that when he came to England for the first time, he thought their accents were just atrocious. They almost sounded like demons to him.
Wow.
And, that's kind of a funny thing. I mean, being an English speaker, I think to myself, how could you have a hard time understanding the accent of somebody who speaks English? But I had a student in particular who came from Ireland. I had to listen very carefully to understand. And I've seen war movies of Scottish soldiers, and very difficult. What's he saying there? I was telling my son the other day, well, I know there's swearing going on, but I can't hear it because of the accent. Well, Lewis comes out of Ireland, and that deeply shapes him. He's called Jack. He never liked the name Clive Staples, which is what
surprising.
CS stands for. Likes to be called Jack, and he was called that his whole life. And a very powerful thing happened to him when he was very young. He was 9 years old. His mother died. And, it wasn't long after that he gave up his Anglican Christian belief and adopted atheism. Mm-hmm. And there have been people who have suggested that maybe part of the atheist phenomenon could be some ways explained by a lack of a parental figure. That idea has been explored in Christian apologetics.
Well, he had a very difficult time with his father.
He did.
I mean, his father was not a very warm, sort of engaging father, even under normal circumstances. But then with the death of his mother, his wife, he just kind of shut down. And so there just wasn't a connection between Lewis and his father all during that time. I don't know that if I recall from his Surprised by Joy, the autobiography that he wrote, that he ever really connected with his father.
I think that's true. And with the loss of his mother, he really loses his faith as an adolescent, and he describes himself in that autobiography, Surprised by Joy, that he was a very bright person, but he was an unhappy child.
Right.
And
he had a brother.
He had an older brother that he was close with his whole life. In fact, Warney was his name. Warren was his name. He called him Warney. They later purchased a home together and lived in the same home together for a very, very long time in the kilns. Mm-hmm. Well, let me talk a little bit about his later life. He wins a scholarship to the University of Oxford, and that study is interrupted by World War I. He is commissioned as a second lieutenant in the First World War, which in those days was called the War to End All Wars. It didn't end all wars. It led to an even greater war.
The Great War, it was called. Yeah.
It was also called the Great War, and Lewis was wounded in battle at the Battle of Arras, and in fact, this is where he experienced trench warfare. Trench warfare was some of the most brutal fighting of the 20th century, either in the First or the Second World War. And Lewis later said that when he was recovering from his injuries, that he went through a period of depression and was really trying to figure out, what his life was all about.
Probably his part too, because of the death of this close friend that he had. He was
very good.
He was this friend that was in the war with him, and they had been friends for many years, and they, in fact, committed themselves to one another. Lewis made a commitment that he would take care of this guy's mother if he didn't, and sister, if this guy, I've forgotten his name, didn't come back from the war.
His name was Edward Paddy Moore.
Moore, yeah.
And I thought that was very interesting, Dave, that, Joe, these two guys became very close as they trained for military life, and they made a pact that if either one of them were killed in battle, the other one would care for the family.
Right.
And I thought, wow, that's
pretty amazing.
An amazing thing. And in fact, Paddy Moore was killed, and Lewis took care of Paddy Moore's mother, which later became somewhat of a controversial relationship, but he called her mother the rest of her life and cared for her and his sister. Yeah, that's...
Wow. There was one other thing that I wanted just to call attention to in his upbringing, is that when his father really wasn't able to take care of him in his younger years, he sent him off to at least 2 or 3 different boarding schools. And some of those were really awful experiences that he relates, as sort of not untypical of the English school system at the time, where he was exposed to a lot of trouble because he was not an athletic individual. He
was Irish.
So he was mistreated a lot and beaten up on occasion, and there was moral tensions that arose because these were typically like all-boys schools. But it was also a time when he was exposed to the teaching of this guy called the Great Knock. I've forgotten what his name was, some lengthy English name, who was a very intellectual teacher-type person who really made Lewis think of straight thinking. He really worked him over that he couldn't get away with any kind of a statement like, I remember some comment about Lewis making a statement when he was first meeting this guy, it was a nice day today. And the guys jumped on him. On what grounds do you say that it was a nice day today?
What justification
do you have for that? And some of the characters in his novels play on this relationship that he had with this guy.
They often say, too, that he had a love for nature. He had a real love for animals, that he and his brother Warney, they kind of anthropomorphized animals. They always had animals talking. And later you see that all through the Chronicles of Narnia, where you have these creatures, talking and things like that. So he was very imaginative in the way that he thought. So
these influences when he was young were very impactful as he grew older.
Well, coming back from the war, he earns his bachelor's degree at Oxford University in 1924. He goes on to be a fellow and tutor in English literature at Magdalen College. That's in Oxford. You actually have a colloquium of colleges. It's not unlike Claremont, not far from the RTB office, where you'll have a university, but it's made up of a number of different particular colleges.
Yeah, instead of departments.
Yes.
In a sense, they're really separate little colleges. And have their own culture. And
that's exactly right. And in 1929, he begins this process of what we would call a conversion. He first is converted to theism, or back to theism, you could say, because as a young boy, he was introduced to kind of an Anglican Christianity, an Anglican Irish Christianity. And then in 1931 to Christianity itself. And this, of course, is explored in his book, Surprised by Joy. But I thought it was very interesting, Dave, that he develops these lifelong friendships with various people. He later has the Inkling group, where he associates with Charles Williams and J.R.R. Tolkien and a number of other people. And what I thought was interesting is that he said that what powerfully impacted him in becoming a Christian was his friendship with Tolkien, who was a Roman Catholic, but also reading people like Chesterton, a very famous Christian apologist of that period.
And George MacDonald was another great
MacDonald was another influence on him. And so reading these people and talking about these kinds of issues, he makes one comment that when he did become a Christian, that Tolkien was disappointed that he had adopted Anglicanism instead of Catholicism. But he does talk a lot about the idea of morality. He talks about issues relating to how to make sense of the world, and this really later comes out in kind of his apologetic arguments. And he relates Christianity to kind of looking at the sun, and he says, Christianity not only kind of illumines my life, but it illumines everything. It makes sense of the world. And this is a process that he goes through, and he actually, in Surprised by Joy, he says that he is a reluctant convert to Christianity. He goes kicking and screaming into the kingdom.
Well,
of
that
God.
was the thing that kind of really struck me, is that it seemed like early in this process, he was kind of challenged to if he thought it was possible, if religion, and in particular Christianity and biblical Christianity and the law, was just something that came out of human reasoning, that we ought to be able to keep the law. And so there was some interaction that he was having with someone. I don't remember the exact details of this, that resulted in him deciding that, okay, I'm going to keep the law. I'm going to commit to following all of the principles that are stated in the law of Moses, I think the Ten Commandments in particular. And I think he understood that it didn't mean just an outward appearance of keeping the law, but it meant he probably was exposed to some of the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, that it had to be something
an
on
inner
the inward.
transformation.
And he tried this for something on the order of a year, and he said it was just a total failure. He could not do it. And I think that's what led him to this place of realizing that there was a God to whom he was going to be accountable. Yeah. And he had this tremendous fear that he was going to be held accountable before this God, and he was just in despair that he couldn't, please this God.
Yeah.
But he was now, as you say, a theist. He believed that there was a God.
Yeah, that was the first
but he was
step.
terrified of this God. And then after some extended period of time of investigating, he never really wanted to consider Christianity as being the answer. He just thought maybe his past experience with it or whatever, it just didn't seem to hit. And he had a lot of problems with Christianity. Of course, the miracles and the natural kinds of things that people struggle with. But that was the title of the book, Surprised by Joy. Maybe you were going to comment on this, comes from the fact that when he finally took the step, as he says, one day he went out for a walk and he wasn't a Christian.
Is the bus ride to the zoo.
This is the bus
he's
ride.
on the motorcycle.
Right, on the motorcycle, that's right.
He starts off and he wasn't a Christian. By the time he got there, he was a Christian.
A revelation, there was an epiphany that happened. And the consequence of it was an experiencing of the joy that he had been seeking all of his life in literature or in experiences or in interactions with people. There would be these glimpses of joy that he would have, this sort of excitement that would kind of permeate his soul, and then it would go away, and he didn't know where it went, and he didn't know how to recover it. And he would try all kinds of things, and then it would happen again, just out of the blue. Yeah. And then he discovered, when he became a Christian, that this was the source of that joy.
Yeah, it's very interesting. He, even though he's raised, and exposed to kind of an Anglican Christianity, when he's 15, he becomes an atheist. Right. But he later writes in a very paradoxical way that he was very angry with God for not existing.
Wow. Okay.
That
Wait a minute. He's scratching my head on that.
He's troubled
by that notion.
Is there a God? No, but I'm angry that he's not there.
Right.
This kind of...
We need him.
Yeah, we need him. In fact, he was... he said during his atheist period that he was fond of quoting the materialist Lucretius, Greek thinker. Lucretius had said, "Had God designed the world, it would not be a world so frail and faulty as we see." And so, through this interaction with reading people like MacDonald and Chesterton, engaging J.R.R. Tolkien and others, working through these kinds of things, you realize later, when he does become a Christian, he picks up these challenges to Christianity, the problem of pain, miracles. He's addressing these. And here is a line from Surprised by Joy, where he becomes a Christian. He says, like a prodigal, kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance to escape. And so it's really a very colorful description of him coming to the Christian faith.
By the way, there is a book that isn't a very commonly read book called Pilgrim's Regress.
Yes.
It's a rather difficult book to read, but there he kind of presents and discusses a lot of the sort of phases that he went through in this search for...
He, by the way, Dave, said that he thought that was one of his best books, and it was one of the books that wasn't well received.
Wow.
Actually, I would have thought that, from my recollection, but he may have said that about this book too, the one that he liked the best of his books was Till We Have Faces, that novel that he wrote.
Yeah. It wrote The Pilgrim's Progress.
Pilgrim's Regress is actually the name of the one that I'm thinking of.
Okay.
Which is a little different,
Well, let's bring his life up to full circle here. He, of course, becomes a very important professor. And one of the things that I've always found very powerful is during World War II, he went on the BBC and he became a broadcaster. He became a radio personality and presented some of the arguments he was developing in the book Mere Christianity, what he called the case for Christianity. The Germans are bombing London during this period, but he became really a rather renowned voice.
Celebrity.
Yeah, because of that kind of thing. He held the chair of medieval and Renaissance English literature at Cambridge from 1954 until his death in 1963. And I thought we should talk a little bit about his marriage. I mean, he was a lifelong bachelor, but in the late 50s, he married a woman named Joy Davidman Gresham. And again, some people have made a play on Surprised by Joy. His wife's name is Joy. And she, of course, develops bone cancer and dies in 1960. So they're not married very long. But she has two sons. And it's interesting.
She's been previously married.
She was divorced.
Right. She was an American.
She was an American.
Divorced. Came to England. Met C.S. Lewis. In fact, deliberately came there for the purpose of meeting with him.
Yes.
Because she was so impressed with his writing. And he was kind of taken aback by her and her kind of aggressive.
She was very bold and aggressive as a lady,
And she, they kind of developed this relationship. And of course, it wasn't intended to be a romantic relationship.
Initially,
but then he married her so that she could stay in England. And I'm trying to remember if she had already discovered at that time that she had cancer or not. I don't completely remember that, but
she was initially ill and then made a recovery.
Right.
And then
but the marriage was purely
for convenience.
For convenience. It wasn't intended to be a real marriage. But then later came, through her sickness, they really developed a close love relationship. And they were kind of remarried, as it were, in the hospital. All
of this is seen in the movie Shadowlands.
I remember that.
Anthony Hopkins plays him in the film.
Two different versions of it. There's an earlier television version.
Yes.
And that was quite good, too. But then more recently,
the big screen.
There was the Hollywood version with Deborah Winger called Shadowlands. And both of them are excellent.
Yeah, I whenever I see Anthony Hopkins, I think of C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
Well, Joy, his wife, had 2 sons, and he adopted those children, Douglas and David. Douglas, of course, became a thoroughgoing Christian and has looked over the estate of Lewis in many respects. The younger son, or another son, David, actually became a Jew and adopted Joy's beliefs prior to her conversion to Christianity, which is kind of an interesting little wrinkle there.
Right.
But the other son became Jewish. And, what's very interesting, of course, is that Lewis, only a few years after his wife died, developed ill health, died a week before his 65th birthday, and he died on November 22nd, 1963, which, of course, is the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated. It's also the same day that Aldous Huxley died, who wrote The Brave New World, kind of a mystical and secular way of thinking at the same time. So many Americans didn't know it for a couple weeks that Lewis had passed away, even though he was a big celebrity here in the States, because of all of the publicity concerning the president's assassination.
Kennedy. Yeah. There's a little story. We're probably coming to the end of this little show here, and I just wanted to relate this story that I heard. At near the very end of his life, he was lying on a bed, somewhat disconnected, and there was an individual. I'm not certain who that was. It may have been his biographer, Hooper. Is that
Hooper?
But I'm not certain.
Who later became the executor of his estate. Yeah.
And Lewis was lying there, and the testimony of this person who was present said that at some particular moment, Lewis just sat up in bed, just totally awake, with this just kind of ecstatic picture on his face, countenance, and just made the statement, "I never could have imagined." And then he plopped back down, kind of went back into his sort of zoning out, and then within some short period of time died.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just thought that was, there was some vision that took place right at that moment. And his statement was, "I never could have imagined."
And that's saying a lot, because he had quite an imagination.
I know, he certainly did.
Well, Joe, this is just a little bit about the life of Lewis, and later in the shows to follow, we want to talk about his accomplishments, talk about him as a Christian apologist. I thought he had a very interesting view of science that we'll talk about, but we'll also talk about his writings. And I think Lewis is clearly one of the most important Christians of the entire 20th century. Somebody that I don't think you could study apologetics and not study C.S. Lewis.
Terrific. We are just getting started, so if you are a student or know of one, be sure to let them know. Share this link and alert them to other podcasts coming as well. This is part 1 of 4, as we mentioned. And Ken, you're going to be recommending resources.
I am
as well. So those are forthcoming. Download our free mobile app available for iPad, iPhone, or Android platforms. You'll find a revolving link on our homepage. This is Joe Aguirre with a reminder that the historic Christian faith involves knowledge and is compatible with reason. Thanks for listening, and join us for the next edition of Straight Thinking.
Learn more about worldviews and critical thinking from Ken Samples through our online courses at reasons.org/learning. This podcast is made possible through the generous gifts from the Friends of Reasons to Believe. For more information on how you can support this podcast, go to reasons.org/donate or call 1-800-482-7836.